The dust had not yet settled on her father's grave when they came to take everything he had left her. Kate Lockhart stood at the edge of the Lockhart homestead on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1883, watching two men in suits pick their way along the rutted lane toward her front porch like they owned the ground beneath their feet. They moved with the particular confidence of men who believed the law was a tool that belonged exclusively to them, and Kate recognized that confidence the way she recognized a rattlesnake by its movement before she ever saw its head. She had grown up watching men like this circle her father's property. She had just never expected them to arrive so quickly after his death. Her father, William Lockhart, had died 3 weeks prior, not from anything dramatic or violent but from a fever that had taken hold of him in February and refused to let go. He had been 58 years old and had worked the land outside of Harlan Creek, Texas, for 22 years. He had built the house with his own hands, fenced the pastures, dug the well, planted the orchard along the south slope, and registered his deed at the county seat in the spring of 1861, when the whole world was going sideways with war. The deed was real. The land was paid for. There was no ambiguity in any of it, at least not in the law as Kate understood it. But she was 26 years old and a woman alone, and in Harlan Creek in 1883, that combination of facts made her vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with the written law and everything to do with the unwritten one. The two men who came up the lane were Gerald Price and his associate, a thin lawyer from San Antonio named Elliot Marsh. Price was the wealthiest man in Harlan Creek and had been attempting, with varying degrees of subtlety, to acquire the Lockhart parcel for the better part of a decade. The land sat directly between Price's cattle operation and the seasonal creek that fed his southern pastures, and owning it would make his already considerable empire complete. He had offered William Lockhart money twice. William had declined both times. Now William was in the ground, and here was Gerald Price walking up the lane with a lawyer. Kate did not retreat into the house. She stayed on the porch, her arms crossed, watching them come. "Miss Lockhart," Price said, removing his hat with what she supposed he intended as a gesture of respect. He was a broad man in his mid-50s, silver-haired, with the ruddy complexion of a man who had spent his youth outdoors but now preferred the indoors. "I wanted to offer my condolences in person. Your father was a fine man." "He was," Kate said. "What do you want, Mr. Price?" Price glanced at Marsh, who opened a leather satchel and produced a folded document with the careful hands of a man presenting something he wished to appear authoritative. "Your father carried a debt, Miss Lockhart. A promissory note from the Harlan Creek Lending Association, signed in 1879. I have recently acquired that note as part of a broader business transaction." Marsh held the document toward her. "The note is now 4 years past its original term, and the balance with interest represents a sum that the estate cannot satisfy. Under the terms of the note, the property serves as collateral." Kate did not take the document. She looked at it, then looked at Marsh, then looked at Price. "My father never told me about any debt," she said. "Many men keep such things from their daughters," Price said, and his voice carried the particular gentleness of a man who knows he is lying, but believes his lie is sophisticated enough not to be detected. "It was a difficult time in 1879, the drought year. Many men borrowed. My father was proud," Kate said slowly, "perhaps too proud to mention it. But I would like to see the original paperwork, the ledgers from the lending association, and the record of the transaction through which you claim to have acquired this note." Marsh blinked. He had not expected that. Most women he visited in circumstances like this did not ask for ledgers. "That can be arranged through the appropriate legal channels," he said. "Then arrange it," Kate said. "Because until I have seen every document in its original form and had the opportunity to have it reviewed, I am not discussing anything further with either of you. This is my land. My father's deed is registered and recorded, and you are welcome to leave the way you came." She went inside and closed the door. She stood with her back against it in the cool dimness of the front room and felt her heart hammering and her hands shaking. She was terrified. She simply had not let them see it. The trouble with being terrified and alone was that terror had nowhere to go but inward, and inward it went, pressing against her ribs all through that afternoon, while she looked through every document her father had kept in the old tin box under the bedroom floorboards. Letters, land records, tax receipts going back to 1862, a photograph of her mother who had died when Kate was 9, and no promissory note. No record of any debt to the Harlan Creek Lending Association or anyone else. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and tried to think clearly about what she needed. She needed a lawyer of her own, and there was no lawyer in Harlan Creek who was not already in some way connected to Gerald Price's interests. She needed someone who understood land law and had no stake in the outcome. And she needed that person quickly, because Price and Marsh would not wait long before they took their document to Judge Alderman, who held court in Harlan Creek on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month, and who had, Kate was fairly certain, eaten dinner at Gerald Price's house on numerous occasions. The next morning she rode to the neighboring town of Callaway, 12 miles west, because she had heard that a new man had set up a modest law practice there, someone from out of the territory, and that he had already successfully argued 2 land cases for small homesteaders against larger operations. She did not know his name. She only knew what she had overheard at the general store 2 months ago, which was a snippet of conversation between her neighbor Hetty Paulson and the dry goods merchant, something about a tall fellow who had ridden in from Colorado and who, apparently, said exactly what he meant and meant exactly what he said. The ride to Callaway took her the better part of 2 hours on her chestnut mare, Cora. The morning was bright and smelled of cedar and warming earth, and Kate tried to appreciate it instead of spending the whole ride catastrophizing. She was mostly unsuccessful at this, but the landscape helped. West Texas in the spring had a particular beauty that was unlike anywhere else she had been, which was not many places, but she had read enough to know the comparison was valid. The sky was enormous and the light was clean, and the rolling hills were painted in every shade of pale green and gold, and somewhere out beyond the next ridge, a meadowlark was singing. She found the law office on Callaway's Main Street between a harness maker and a small hotel. The sign above the door read simply, T. Dalton, Attorney A.T. Law, established 1882. Inside it was tidier than she expected. There was a desk covered in organized stacks of papers, 2 chairs for clients, a bookshelf that covered 1 full wall and was filled with actual books, which impressed her, and a wood stove that was not currently burning because the morning was warm enough without it. The man behind the desk looked up when she came in. She had expected someone older. He looked to be perhaps 30, maybe a year or 2 past it, with dark hair that wanted cutting and gray eyes that were direct without being unkind. He was broad through the shoulders and had the look of a man who had done physical work at some point in his life, though his hands now held a pen, and there was ink on 2 of his fingers. He stood when she entered, which she noted. "Good morning," he said. "I'm Timothy Dalton. Please sit down." His voice was even and calm, and there was something steadying about it that she had not anticipated needing quite so immediately. "Kate Lockhart," she said, taking the chair across from him. "I have a land problem." "Tell me about it," he said, and sat back down and picked up his pen, not in a way that suggested he intended to write immediately, but in the way of a man who holds something familiar when he is listening carefully. She told him everything. She told him about her father's death, about Price and Marsh arriving with the document, about the promissory note she had never heard of, about the lending association, about the deed that was registered and real, and about Judge Alderman and his dinners at Price's house. She told him about the tin box and the documents she had found and the ones she had not found. She told him she had no money to speak of, that her father had left her the land and the house and the livestock and enough provisions to see her through the summer if she was careful, But that cash was not something she had in any meaningful quantity. Timothy Dalton listened to all of this without interrupting. He made 3 small notes on a piece of paper. When she finished, there was a brief silence. "The promissory note," he said. "Did you get a look at the signatures?" "I did not touch the document. I refused to take it." He nodded slowly. "That was wise. Do you know when the Harlan Creek Lending Association was established?" "I don't," she said. "I do," he said, and the quiet certainty in it made her look at him more sharply. The Harlan Creek Lending Association was chartered in 1881. If the note your father supposedly signed is dated 1879, there is a problem with that document that predates any question of whether the debt is paid. Kate felt something loosen in her chest, just slightly. "It's forged," she said. "That would be my initial suspicion," he said carefully. "Though suspicion and proof are different things, and I would want to examine the document before stating anything definitive. What I can tell you is that if the institution the note claims as originator did not exist at the time the note was supposedly signed, that is a significant legal problem for anyone presenting that note as legitimate." He set down his pen. "Miss Lockhart, I will take your case. As for the matter of payment, I will accept a deferred arrangement. If we prevail, we will discuss it then. If we do not prevail, you will owe me nothing, because you will have lost enough already." She had not been prepared for that, and the unexpectedness of it made her throat tighten in a way she refused to let become visible. "Why would you do that?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because what is happening to you is wrong, and I am in a position to do something about it." It was a simple answer. She believed it completely. She rode back to the Lockhart homestead that afternoon feeling for the first time since her father died that she was not entirely alone against what was coming. Timothy Dalton appeared at her property the following morning with a leather case and a notepad, and spent 2 hours going through every document in the tin box, asking her questions, making careful notes, and examining the deed with the thoroughness of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at. He was quiet and focused, and she found herself watching him more than she intended to, which she attributed to the fact that she was accustomed to being alone, and any human presence was notable. She made coffee. He accepted a cup without making a fuss about it, which she appreciated. "The deed is excellent," he said when he had set the last document down. "The registration is solid. The tax records show continuous payment, which establishes your family's claim without any interruption. This is a strong position, Miss Lockhart." He looked up. "Price is going to move quickly, though. He will want to bring this before Judge Alderman before we have time to mount a proper response. We need to be ready." "What does being ready look like?" she asked. "It looks like appearing before the court ourselves, armed with documentation and argument, before he can have the matter decided in a private morning session that no one knows about until it is too late." He set his notepad on the table and looked at her steadily. "I want to tell you something honestly, Miss Lockhart. Aldermen may not rule fairly. There are judges in this territory who have decided that men like Price are more important to the functioning of their own careers than the law is, and Alderman has a history that concerns me. If we cannot get a fair hearing from him, we may need to take this to the district court in San Antonio." "That would take time," she said. "It would," he agreed. "And Price could move to take possession of the property in the interim. Which is why I intend to take this to the town of Harlan Creek itself before we ever get to a courtroom." He said it calmly, as if he had been thinking about it for some time. "There is a town hall meeting scheduled for next week. First Thursday of the month. The whole county attends. I want to bring this before the community." Kate stared at him. "Price has allies in that room." "He does," Timothy said, "but he also has neighbors, and neighbors talk. If the facts of this case are known publicly, it becomes significantly harder for anyone to act improperly without consequence." He paused. "It is a risk. I want you to understand that. It could go badly, but I think the people of Harlan Creek, by and large, are decent. And decent people, when they understand what is happening, tend to respond accordingly." She thought about Hetty Paulson, who had brought her a pot of stew the day after her father's funeral. She thought about the Garza family at the next homestead over, who had sent their oldest son to help her with the fence line in March. She thought about old Doc Renner, who had sat with her father in his final days and refused to take payment. "All right," she said. "We go to the town hall." The days between that morning and the town hall meeting were some of the most uncomfortable of Kate's life. She was not accustomed to waiting. She was accustomed to working, and there was work enough on the homestead to keep her occupied from before dawn until after dark, which helped. She fed the animals and repaired the fence section that had come down near the orchard, and turned the garden soil and did the 1,000 small tasks that a property demanded. And at the end of each day, she was tired enough that sleep came for her before she could spend too long staring at the ceiling. Timothy came back twice in that week. The first time to bring her copies of the documents he had been assembling, records he had requested from the county clerk, a letter he had written to the state records office in Austin requesting information about the Harlan Creek Lending Association's charter date, and a long handwritten analysis of the legal position they occupied. She read everything carefully and asked questions, and he answered them with the same evenness that seemed to characterize everything about him. The second visit was less formal. He arrived at late afternoon when she was in the yard with a bucket of feed for the chickens, and she did not hear him until Cora nickered at his horse from the pasture. "I wanted to walk the property line," he said, dismounting. "If you are willing. I want to understand the land itself, not just the paper description." She was willing. She left the chickens to their own devices and walked the property with him for the better part of an hour, along the eastern fence and down through the south pasture, where the land dropped toward the creek, and the old cottonwood trees grew in a line that marked the water. The light was going golden and the air had cooled and the creek ran clear over its rocky bed, and somewhere upstream a mockingbird was running through its repertoire. "This is good land," he said, standing at the creek's edge and looking along it. His voice was quiet, not the professional voice she had heard in the office, but something less guarded. "My father used to say the same thing," she said. "He said there was nowhere else he ever wanted to be." Timothy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Where did he come from originally?" "Tennessee," she said. "He came west in 1859. He had a brother who had come out first and sent letters back saying the land was extraordinary. The brother didn't stay, but my father did." "And your mother?" "She grew up in New Mexico Territory. She came to Texas when she was 17 and met my father at a church social in Harlan Creek and married him 3 months later." Kate smiled, just slightly. "He always said he knew from the first evening." She used to roll her eyes when he told that story, but you could tell she believed it too. Timothy looked at her sidelong in a way that was brief and careful. "How long has it been since she died?" 17 years, Kate said. "I was 9. "Do you remember her well?" "Very well," Kate said. "She was the kind of person you remember in sharp detail. She had opinions about everything and she wasn't quiet about them, which was not always comfortable, but she was always interesting." She paused. "My father said I take after her. I think he meant it as a compliment." Timothy smiled at that, and it was the first time she had seen him smile, a genuine one rather than the professional courteous version, and it changed his face considerably. He looked younger. He looked like someone she might have known under different circumstances. "I think it probably was a compliment," he said. They walked back along the creek and then up through the orchard, where the apple trees were in early leaf and the pear trees were budding, and at the edge of the orchard where the ground rose again toward the house, she stopped and looked back at the whole sweep of the property in the evening light. "I'm not going to lose this," she said. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. It was something in between. Timothy stood beside her and looked at the same view. "No," he said, "you are not." She believed him, and not just because she needed to. She believed him because everything she had seen of him in the past week suggested that he was the kind of man who did not say things he did not mean. The Thursday of the town hall meeting arrived on a clear, mild evening. Kate dressed carefully, not for vanity's sake, but because she understood that appearances shape perception, and she wanted the people of Harlan Creek to see a woman who was composed and sure of herself rather than a woman who was frightened, even though she was both. She wore her mother's dark blue dress and her best boots, and braided her dark auburn hair and pinned it properly. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and decided she looked like someone who belonged on that land, which was the point. Timothy met her at the edge of town. He was wearing a dark jacket and a good hat, and he had shaved, which she noticed only because he had not shaved on either of his 2 visits to the property, and the difference was notable. He looked, she thought, like someone who could walk into a room and be taken seriously. She was glad of it. "How are you?" he asked as she dismounted. "Nervous," she said, because she had decided somewhere in the last week that honesty was the appropriate register with him. "That is reasonable," he said. "I am also nervous. But I have gone over everything 4 times and the position is solid. Remember that." The Harlan Creek Town Hall was a large room above the general store, accessible by an exterior staircase on the side of the building. By the time Kate and Timothy arrived, most of the community was already there. She recognized nearly everyone. The Garza family in the 2nd row, Hetty Paulson and her husband Frank near the window, Doc Renner in the back, his white hair standing up as it always did. The Hennessy brothers who ran the livery stable standing along the wall. The Calloway family who farmed the valley to the north. And there, in the front row to the left, Gerald Price and Elliot Marsh, both of them dressed in the kind of clothes that broadcast money without shouting it. Judge Alderman was not at the town hall. He was not required to be, since this was not a court proceeding. But the alcalde of Harlan Creek, a broad sunburned man named Mayor Horace Blum, presided over these monthly meetings with the comfortable authority of a man who had been doing so for 12 years. The meeting moved through its ordinary business first. A question about the water rights on the North Channel, a report on the school fund, a discussion about the state of the road between Harlan Creek and the county seat. Kate sat and kept her hands folded in her lap and felt her heart beating too fast and refused to let it show on her face. When the ordinary business concluded, Mayor Blum opened the floor to other matters, as was the custom. Elliot Marsh stood immediately. "I would like to bring to the community's attention," he said, in his precise San Antonio lawyer's voice, "a matter of a delinquent debt that has direct bearing on the organization of property in this county. The Lockhart parcel, some 240 acres adjacent to Price Creek, was pledged as collateral against a promissory note which has not been satisfied. Mr. Price, having acquired this note through a legitimate business transaction, is prepared to take possession under the terms of the original agreement." He paused for effect. "I present this publicly in the spirit of transparency so that the community is aware of the legal process that will be forthcoming." There was a murmur in the room. Kate felt eyes moving to her. She kept her own eyes level and her expression still. Mayor Blum looked toward her. "Miss Lockhart, is there something you wish to say?" Before she could answer, Timothy Dalton rose to his feet. He was taller than most of the men in the room, and he stood easily, without the self-consciousness of someone who was performing rather than speaking. When he looked around the room, it was not with the aggressive scan of a man trying to establish dominance, but with the quieter survey of a man who has decided what he believes and is comfortable with anyone knowing it. "My name is Timothy Dalton," he said. "I am an attorney, and I represent Miss Kate Lockhart in this matter. I would like to address several things Mr. Marsh has just said." He spoke to the room rather than to Marsh, which was an instinct that served him well, because the room was the point. "The first is the claim that the promissory note presented by Mr. Price is a legitimate document. It is not. The note purports to be dated 1879 and signed with a lending institution called the Harlan Creek Lending Association. The Harlan Creek Lending Association was chartered in 1881. I have in my possession a certified copy of that charter from the State Records Office in Austin, confirming the date of establishment." He held up the document. "A note signed with an institution that did not exist at the time of signing is not a legal promissory note. It is a fabrication. The murmur in the room changed character entirely. Marsh was on his feet. That charter date is a matter of interpretation, and I object to this proceeding being used as a forum for— "Sit down, Mr. Marsh," Timothy said, without raising his voice. He said it the way a man says something when he is fully certain he is correct, and the certainty itself carried more authority than volume would have. Marsh sat down. Timothy continued. "The second matter I wish to address is Miss Lockhart's claim to this land. Her father, William Lockhart, registered the deed to the parcel known as the Lockhart homestead at the Harlan Creek County seat on March the 14th, 1861. 22 years of continuous tax payments follow, every one of them recorded. I have those records as well." He set the documents on the table in front of Mayor Blum. "Miss Lockhart is the sole heir of her father, who died intestate, which under the laws of the state of Texas means the property passes directly to her in full. Her claim is not ambiguous. Her claim is not in dispute under any legitimate legal reading. Her claim is absolute." He looked around the room once more, and then he said the words that Kate would remember for the rest of her life, spoken in that even, certain voice in that crowded room above the general store. "Her claim is rightful, and I am prepared to defend it in every court in the state until that fact is recognized by every authority that has the power to recognize it." The room was very quiet for a moment. Then Frank Paulson in the second row said, "I knew William Lockhart for 15 years. He never borrowed money in his life." And the room came alive. Not chaotically, not in the frantic way of crowds that have lost their order, but in the way of people who have been told something they suspected was happening and have now been given the words to respond to it. The Garza patriarch stood and said he had seen the surveyor's price sent onto the Lockhart land last summer and had always thought it was curious. The Hennessy brothers looked at each other and then at Price with expressions that were not friendly. Old Doc Renner said from the back of the room, loudly enough to be heard by everyone, "Any man who would forge a document against a widow's homestead 2 weeks after her father is buried ought to be ashamed to show his face here." Gerald Price stood then, and his face was a difficult color. "Now see here, Mr. Price," Mayor Blum said, and his voice had changed. The comfortable 12-year authority had become something harder. "I think you should speak with your lawyer about this, outside." Timothy remained standing. He was looking at Kate. She was looking at him. In that moment, surrounded by the noise and motion of a room that had turned, she felt something she had not felt since before her father got sick, which was the specific warmth of not being alone. And she looked at this man who had stood up in a room full of people and said the words that her father would have said if he were still alive to say them, and she felt something shift inside her that had nothing to do with the legal case and everything to do with him. Price and Marsh left. They did not make it a graceful exit, but they made it, and the room watched them go. And afterward Mayor Blum shook Timothy's hand and said he would be writing to the district court in San Antonio himself to request a review of the matter, and that in the interim he expected the Lockhart property to remain exactly as it was. Outside, afterward, the evening had turned cool and the stars were beginning. Kate stood at the hitching rail with her hand on Cora's neck and felt the relief moving through her like creek water, slow and real and cleaning out all the places where the fear had been sitting. Timothy came to stand beside her. He had his jacket over his arm and his hat in his hand, and he looked, she thought, slightly more human than he had inside, which was to say he looked slightly tired and slightly relieved himself. "You were extraordinary in there," she said. He shook his head. "I was prepared, which is different." "No," she said, "it isn't. Being prepared is how you become extraordinary." She looked at him. "You stood up in that room and told the truth in front of everyone. You could have done this through correspondence and courtroom filings, and you chose to do it where people could hear it and where Price couldn't suppress it. That was a choice." He was quiet for a moment. "I believed it was the right approach." "So did I," she said. "That is why I agreed to it." She paused. "Thank you, Mr. Dalton. I mean that in a way that does not entirely have words." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she held his gaze and felt the particular charge of a moment in which two people are simultaneously aware that something is happening between them that did not exist an hour ago. "I should see you home," he said. "It is a long ride in the dark." "You don't need to," she said. "I know I don't need to," he said. "I would like to," she let him. They rode the 12 miles between Callaway and the Lockhart homestead at the easy pace that darkness and starlight and a good road permitted, and they talked the whole way. Not about the case, which felt suddenly like a chapter that had been read and set down, but about other things. He told her he was from Denver originally, that his father had been a carpenter, and his mother had run a boarding house, that he had read law under a practicing attorney for 3 years before passing his examination, that he had come to West Texas because he had heard the territory was growing, and that growing places had more need for someone who understood the law than settled places did. He had been in Callaway for 14 months. He had handled 11 cases. He had won 9 of them. She told him about growing up on the homestead, about learning to ride when she was 4, about her father teaching her to read from the Bible, and then from every other book he could get his hands on, about the summer she was 16 when a neighbor's barn burned, and the whole community came together to rebuild it in 3 days, about the way the land changed through the seasons, and how you had to pay attention to it or it would take you by surprise. He listened the way she had noticed him listening before, with his full attention and without the particular impatience of men who are waiting for a pause long enough to insert their own opinions. It was a quality she found herself appreciating more with every mile. At the gate of the homestead he dismounted to open it for her, which was unnecessary but kind. She rode through and he followed and closed it behind them, and they went up the lane to the house where the porch lantern was still burning, which meant she had remembered to light it before she left, which now struck her as a bit of good fortune. She dismounted. He dismounted. They stood in the pool of lantern light with the horses patient behind them and the night enormous above, and the crickets were singing and the air smelled of the apple trees and the creek. "I should go," he said. "Yes," she agreed. Neither of them moved immediately. "I find myself wanting to come back," he said, and she recognized in his voice the quality of a man who is being honest at the cost of some effort. "Then come back," she said, with a steadiness that she almost managed to mean completely. "The fence along the north pasture still needs attention, and I imagine there will be legal correspondence to review." The corner of his mouth lifted. "Is that an invitation?" "It is a statement of fact," she said. "You may interpret it however you like." He rode back toward Callaway. She went inside. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time in the quiet house with the lantern burning, and her heart was doing something it had not done in quite this way before, and she found that she did not mind it at all. The week that followed was a good one. Word spread through the community the way word did, carried on wagon beds and at post offices and over fence lines. And by Wednesday there were 2 letters at the county clerk's office from citizens requesting a formal investigation into the lending association document that Price and Marsh had presented. Mayor Blum, good to his word, had dispatched his own letter to the district court, and Elliot Marsh had apparently left Harlan Creek entirely, which Kate heard from Hetty Paulson, who heard it from the woman at the hotel who had watched him check out with an expression of someone who had remembered a previous engagement in another territory. Price was still in Harlan Creek. He was not a man who retreated entirely, but he had gone quiet, which was the next best thing. Timothy came back to the homestead on Friday. He had letters to go over with her, correspondence from Austin and from the district court acknowledging receipt of the dispute. He also had a copy of the certified statement he had submitted formally challenging the validity of the promissory note, which was a dense and detailed document that she read completely and found impressive. They sat at the kitchen table to go through it all, as they had done before, with coffee between them and the morning sun coming through the east window, and somewhere in the middle of discussing the district court's preliminary response, She looked up and found him looking at her with an expression that he did not immediately rearrange when he was caught. "Sorry," he said. "Don't apologize," she said. And then, because she was her mother's daughter and had never been particularly good at pretending she did not notice things, she said, "What were you thinking?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I was thinking that you are the most capable person I have met in 14 months of living in this county." She felt warmth move up her neck and refused to be embarrassed by it. "That is a high bar," she said, "given some of the people you must have encountered." "It is a high bar," he agreed. "You clear it considerably." She looked down at the document in front of her and then back at him. "I think you should know," she said carefully, "that I am aware this is not simply about the legal case for me anymore." He held her gaze. "Nor for me," he said, with the same quiet directness he brought to everything. And that was how they began, not with a dramatic declaration in the rain or a sweep of music from somewhere improbable, but sitting at a kitchen table with coffee going cold and legal documents spread between them, and the morning light making everything very clear and honest. He came to the homestead more often after that. Sometimes for legal reasons, and sometimes because the fence needed attention, as she had accurately predicted, and sometimes simply because Sunday afternoons were long and the road between Callaway and the Lockhart homestead was a good one, and Cora and his own horse, a steady gray gelding he called Franklin after no one in particular, were agreeable company for each other. Kate taught him the particulars of her orchard, and he fixed the east gate hinge that had been troubling her for months. She made Sunday dinners that were genuinely good, because her father had believed cooking was a skill worth having regardless of one's gender, and had taught her everything his own mother had taught him. Timothy brought books from Callaway, volumes he thought she would like, which she always did, because he had paid enough attention to know her tastes accurately. There was a Sunday in May when a late-season thunderstorm rolled across the plains from the northwest and caught them both in the orchard where they had been inspecting the pear crop. They ran for the porch and made it before the full weight of it came down, and stood there together watching the rain fall in silver sheets across the green pasture, and the creek run high and brown at the bottom of the south slope, and the lightning flickering in the purple distance. "I love storms," Kate said. She had her arms hugged around herself and her hair was slightly damp at the edges from the run across the yard. "Most people are afraid of them," he said. "I was when I was small," she said. "My mother used to sit with me on this porch and watch them. She said a storm was proof that the world was enormous and we were small, and that there was something comforting in that if you let it be." She paused. I eventually agreed with her. Timothy was leaning against the porch post with his arms folded, watching the rain, and she was aware of his nearness without being overwhelmed by it, which was itself a kind of peace. "My mother," he said, "used to say that storms were the world being honest about its mood, which is why she preferred them to fine weather, which she said was merely polite." Kate laughed, genuinely, and looked at him. "I think I would have liked your mother." "She would have liked you immediately," he said, and she could see that he meant it precisely. The storm lasted an hour and they sat through all of it, talking and sometimes not talking, and when it cleared and the evening light came back clean and brilliant and smelling of wet sage and cedar, it was the most comfortable Kate had felt in anyone's presence since her father had been well, and the world had made its ordinary sense. A letter arrived from the district court in San Antonio on the 23rd of May. Timothy brought it to her in person, rather than letting it sit at the post office. It was formal and measured in its language, as district court correspondence tended to be, but its content was clear. The court had reviewed the preliminary documentation submitted by Timothy Dalton on behalf of Kate Lockhart, and had found sufficient question regarding the validity of the promissory note presented by Gerald Price to warrant a full hearing. The hearing was scheduled for the 15th of June in San Antonio. More importantly, the letter contained a stay of any action regarding the Lockhart property pending the outcome of that hearing. Nothing could move against her legally until the district court had spoken. Kate read the letter through twice at the kitchen table while Timothy watched her and waited. "This is good," she said when she looked up. "This is very good," he said. "The stay alone is a significant development, and the court's language about the document's validity is not neutral. They are already skeptical." "Will it hold?" she asked. "In San Antonio?" "Yes," he said, with the steady certainty she had come to rely on. "The evidence is overwhelming, Kate. The charter date alone is determinative. The tax records, the deed registration, the absence of any legitimate lending activity by this association, all of it together forms a case that a fair court will resolve in your favor." He paused. "And San Antonio is outside Price's sphere of influence." She let out a slow breath. "Then we go to San Antonio." "We go to San Antonio," he said. The journey to San Antonio was 3 days by wagon, along roads that varied considerably in quality, and through landscapes that changed as they went south and east, from the open rolling country of the hill region through heavier timber, and then out into flatter ground where the sky spread out again in a different configuration. Kate had been to San Antonio once before, when she was 12 with her father, and she remembered it as an enormous and bewildering place. It remained enormous, though she was no longer 12 and less easily bewildered. Timothy had engaged a boarding house for her near the courthouse district, a clean and well-run establishment run by a woman named Mrs. Calderon, who asked no unnecessary questions and set a good breakfast table. He stayed at a small hotel 2 streets away, which was proper, and she appreciated that he navigated the question of propriety without making it awkward or drawing attention to it. The evening before the hearing, they walked along the river where the cottonwoods were in full summer leaf, and the water moved slow and green in the fading light. San Antonio was alive around them, the sounds of a city moving through its evening, horses and voices and music from somewhere beyond the bridge, and the smell of supper cooking from half a dozen establishments along the street. "Are you ready?" she asked him as they walked. "I am," he said. "Are you?" "I have been ready since the morning they came up my father's lane," she said. He looked at her with the expression she had been learning to recognize, the one that was not his professional expression or his focused reading expression or his thoughtful quiet expression, but the one that was simply him looking at her. "Kate," he said. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. "I want to say something to you before tomorrow," he said, "because tomorrow will be occupied with other things, and I don't want it to get lost." He was holding his hat in both hands, which was the only sign she had ever seen of him being at a loss for easy ease. "I came to Callaway 14 months ago with the intention of building a practice and doing useful work, and not complicating my life with anything I wasn't prepared for. I was quite firm about that intention." He looked at her steadily. "And then you rode into my office with your land records and your absolute refusal to be defeated, and I find that my intentions have revised themselves considerably." She was very still. The cottonwood leaves moved above them in the evening air. "What I mean to say," he said, with a kind of careful patience that she recognized as a man who wants to say something precisely and refuses to rush it, "is that I have come to love you. And I want you to know that independently of this case and its outcome and anything else that complicates the picture, because I want you to know that I am not saying it because I think I ought to, or because it is convenient, or because the circumstances have manufactured it. I am saying it because it is true, and I believe you deserve to hear true things." The river moved beside them and the cottonwoods whispered, and the city went on being alive around them, and none of that was particularly relevant to this moment. "Timothy," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt, "I have been aware for some time that I feel something for you that I have not felt before. I have been somewhat cautious about naming it because I am a practical person and naming things makes them real, and real things can be lost." "Yes," he said, "but I think," she said, "that not naming it does not protect it. It only makes it smaller than it is." She looked at him. "I love you too. That is the true thing from my side." He reached out and took her hand, which was not a dramatic gesture in the context of everything but was the right one. They stood there at the edge of the river with the evening coming down around them and his hand warm around hers, and it was not a complicated moment. It was a simple one, which is the best kind. They walked back along the river in the gathering dark, and she held his hand and felt entirely certain, for the first time in a very long time, about the direction of things. The district court hearing was held in a high-ceilinged room that smelled of old wood and linseed oil, and the particular solemnity of a place that has been used for serious things for many years. Judge Leonard Grayson presided, a lean man in his 60s with white sideburns and the expression of a man who had heard every variety of argument and was not easily impressed. Gerald Price had retained a new lawyer, a man named Kaufman from Austin who was presumably better connected than Marsh, and Kaufman was polished and prepared and confident. Timothy was better. He presented the case in a clear and organized sequence that did not admit confusion or distraction. He began with the charter date of the Harlan Creek Lending Association, establishing definitively that it could not have issued a note in 1879. He then moved through the deed and tax records, establishing the completeness and legitimacy of Kate's claim. He produced the certified documents from Austin, the county records from Harlan Creek, and a sworn affidavit from the county clerk confirming the registration date of William Lockhart's original deed. Kaufman argued for the legitimacy of the note with a sophistication that was impressive and, ultimately, insufficient. There was nothing he could do about the charter date. It was a fact, and facts in the hands of someone who understands them are among the most powerful things available in a courtroom. Judge Grayson took the matter under advisement at noon and returned his decision at 3 in the afternoon. The promissory note was declared fraudulent. The claim against the Lockhart property was dismissed in full. The deed and all attendant rights remained with Kate Lockhart. The court further noted, in language that was formal but pointed, that the submission of a fraudulent document in the context of a property claim was a serious matter warranting further inquiry, and that the relevant authorities were being so notified. Gerald Price left the courtroom without looking at Kate or Timothy. Kaufman, to his credit, shook Timothy's hand, which was the gesture of a man who recognized a well-argued case even in defeat. Kate sat in the gallery after the room had mostly cleared and breathed slowly and felt the victory settle through her. It was real. The land was hers. Her father's work was not going to be undone by a forged document and a corrupt scheme. She had stood her ground, found the right ally, and the right ally had stood up in every room that required standing in, and they had won cleanly on the merits of the case. Timothy sat down beside her in the mostly empty gallery. "It's over," she said. "It's over," he confirmed. She looked at him. His expression was quietly satisfied, not triumphant, just the particular satisfaction of a man who has done a thing right. "What happens to Price?" she asked. "The court's referral means there will likely be an investigation into the fraudulent document," he said. "How far that goes depends on the willingness of the relevant authorities to pursue it. In my experience, men like Price have enough influence to soften the consequences of things like this. He will not be unaffected. Whether he will face the full weight of what he attempted is less certain." She nodded. "But the land is mine." "The land is yours," he said, "fully and completely and documented so thoroughly that no one will trouble it again." She reached across and took his hand. Right there in the gallery of the district court with the afternoon light coming through the tall windows, and she held it firmly and did not let go for a while. They spent one more day in San Antonio before beginning the 3-day journey back. Kate had not been to San Antonio since she was 12, and Timothy had never been, and they spent the morning walking through the city, seeing the old mission, looking at the markets where goods from all directions came together in a colorful and occasionally aromatic abundance. She bought a length of blue calico at a fabric stall because it was beautiful and she had just won a legal case, and she felt that such a thing was warranted. He bought a new book at a bookseller's shop, and also, after some consideration, a small cameo brooch that he did not mention at the time but which she would discover later. That evening they had supper at a restaurant near Mrs. Calderon's boarding house, a proper supper at a proper table with a tablecloth and actual dishes, something Kate had not done since before her father's illness. They talked about the case, and about what would happen next, and about how the land would be different now that the threat to it was lifted, and she could make real plans rather than holding everything provisional against the possibility of losing. She wanted to expand the orchard. She had always thought the west slope had good drainage for more pear trees. She wanted to increase the kitchen garden and possibly start selling produce at the Harlan Creek market. She had ideas for the south pasture better management that her father had never gotten around to, but that she had thought about for years. Timothy listened to all of this and asked questions that demonstrated he was actually thinking about it rather than merely waiting for his turn. And at some point during the second cup of coffee she realized she was describing a future that she was imagining in the plural, the kind of plural that includes more than one person. She looked at him across the table. "I am imagining," she said carefully, "that you are part of these plans. I don't know if that is a presumption." He held her gaze and set down his coffee cup. "It is not a presumption," he said. "It is something I have been thinking about as well, and I was trying to determine the right moment to raise it." "This seems like an adequate moment," she said. "It does," he said. He was quiet for a beat, gathering himself in the way she had learned to recognize, the way he gathered himself before saying something important. "I would like to marry you, Kate. I would like to very much. But I want to say it in the plainest way I know how rather than making it more elaborate than it needs to be. Because you are someone who prefers plain truth to elaborate performance, and that is one of the many things I love about you." She looked at him for a long moment. The restaurant was murmuring around them, and the candlelight was warm, and the whole city was going about its business entirely unconcerned with what was happening at this particular table. "Yes," she said, "I would like that too." He smiled, and it was the full version of the smile, the one that changed his whole face, and she felt warmth flood through her from somewhere in the vicinity of her sternum. He reached into his jacket pocket and set the small cameo brooch on the table between them. She looked at it. It was ivory on dark blue, a woman's profile, elegant and simple. "It's not a ring," he said. "I did not want to presume the ring before the question was answered. We can see to the ring when we get home." "When we get home," she repeated, and the words felt like what they were, a kind of promise. She picked up the brooch and pinned it to her dress, right there at the table, and he watched her do it with an expression that she thought she would remember for a very long time. The journey back to the hill country was better than the journey down, because the pressure that had been with her for months was gone and the road ahead was nothing but open. They talked steadily for 3 days, and she did not run out of things to say, and neither did he, which told her something important about the nature of what they had between them. They arrived back in the Harlan Creek and Callaway territory on a Friday afternoon in June, and the land was green and brilliant after the previous week's rain, and the creek was running high and clear, and the cottonwoods along the south fence were enormous in their summer leaves, and the whole property glowed in the way it sometimes did in the late afternoon light of a clear June day, like something that had been polished from inside. Kate rode through her gate and up the lane to her house and stepped down from the saddle and stood looking at it all. The house her father built with his own hands, the orchard he had planted, the pasture he had fenced, the well he had dug, and she felt him very present in all of it in the particular way that people stay present in the things they have made. "This is yours," Timothy said from beside her. "Ours," she said quietly and looked at him. "Or it will be." The weeks that followed were full of the kind of ordinary busy happiness that Kate had not known for some time, and that proved to be the best variety. There was the homestead work, which continued regardless of everything else, and there was the matter of the wedding to arrange, which they decided would be simple and at the end of the summer, after the harvest was in, and the community could gather without the pressure of the busiest season. Hetty Paulson, upon being told the news, cried a little and then immediately began making practical suggestions, which was entirely in character. The Garza family brought gifts of food and offered their eldest daughter, a bright girl of 17 who did not figure romantically here, to help with whatever was needed. Mayor Blum, who heard about everything eventually, stopped Timothy on the street in Harlan Creek and shook his hand for a very long time. Timothy wound down his Callaway practice with consideration and care, resolving the cases he had open, writing letters to his clients, recommending a colleague who was setting up in the county seat. He moved his books and his papers and the modest collection of things he had accumulated to the Lockhart homestead, which was large enough to accommodate a study in the room that Kate's father had used as a spare bedroom. His name would eventually be on the deed alongside hers. He insisted on this only in the sense of making it plain that it seemed right, and she agreed, and it was done. Gerald Price did not disappear from the county. He was too established for that. But the investigation that the district court had initiated proved to have more teeth than Timothy had initially expected. Elliot Marsh, apparently unwilling to absorb the full consequences of a matter he had been paid to execute, cooperated with investigators from Austin in a way that was damaging to Price's interests. The outcome was not criminal prosecution, the machinery of that being slow and complicated, but it was financial and reputational and social, and Price found himself in a position of diminished authority in the county that he did not recover from quickly. The dinner invitations to his house from the mayor did not resume. The lending association, under investigation, quietly dissolved. The community, which had seen what had been attempted at the town hall meeting and understood it, did not forget. Kate was not interested in pursuing Price further than the law had already taken things. She was not constitutionally inclined toward prolonged vengeance, which she considered an expensive habit. The land was hers. The case was won. She had better things to put her attention toward. The wedding happened on a Saturday at the end of August, when the harvest was in, and the air was beginning to cool, and the light had taken on the particular gold quality of late summer in the Texas Hill Country. They married in the small stone church in Harlan Creek, with the minister who had buried William Lockhart 3 months earlier now presiding over something considerably more cheerful. The whole community came, or what felt like the whole community. The Garza family, the Paulson family, the Hennessy brothers, Doc Renner, Mayor Blum, the Callaway family, and a great many others who had known William Lockhart, and who came partly to celebrate what his daughter had done, and partly because they were the kind of community that showed up for things. Kate wore a dress she had made herself from the blue calico she had bought in San Antonio, which Hetty Paulson said was the most beautiful thing she had seen in years. She carried a small bunch of flowers from her own garden, white and yellow, because that was what was blooming, and it seemed appropriate to carry something from the land. She walked down the aisle of the little church on her own, because there was no longer a father to give her away, but she walked with her head level and her eyes on Timothy at the far end, and she felt no lack in it because the walk was hers, and the arrival was to someone who was waiting for her, with an expression she would spend the rest of her life recognizing across rooms. Timothy wore his good dark jacket and a silk cravat that Hetty had apparently pressed with some ceremony, and he looked, Kate thought, like the exact right person. He looked like someone who belonged in this life she was building. The minister said the words, and they said the words back, and Timothy placed a plain gold band on her finger, and she placed its mate on his. And then it was done, and the whole church seemed to exhale a collective satisfaction that was partly relief and partly joy, and partly the particular pleasure a community takes in a story that ends the way it ought to. The celebration afterward was in the yard of the Lockhart homestead, because it was the largest property available, and because it felt right that the place that had been fought over should also be the place where the fighting's resolution was celebrated. Tables were set up in the yard and the orchard, and there was food enough for twice the number of people present. Because this was Texas, and every woman in the county had apparently decided to cook something. And there was music from a fiddle player named Rodriguez, who was apparently the most sought-after entertainment in the county, and who played everything from waltzes to reels with equal energy, and considerably more volume than the setting strictly required. Timothy danced with Kate twice, which was not sufficient from her perspective, and then danced with Hetty Paulson once because Hetty had been so kind and it would have been rude not to, and then came back to Kate for the rest of the evening, which was where she preferred him to be. At some point in the late evening, when the lanterns were lit and the fiddle had gone quieter, and the children were falling asleep in corners, and the grown people were talking in the slow way of a good party running toward its close, Kate and Timothy stood at the edge of the orchard together, looking back at the house and the yard and all the lit faces of the people who were there. "Is it what you imagined?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Better," she said, "more real. Imagined things are always a little pale compared to actual things." "That's true," he said. "Actual things are considerably more present." She leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they stood like that while the fiddle played something slow and sweet, and the lantern light made everything warm, and the orchard breathed its summer breath around them. "My father would have liked you," she said. "He liked people who said what they meant." "What did he say about people who didn't?" "He said they were saving their real words for an occasion that never came," she said. "He had a lot of opinions about honesty." "He sounds like a man I would have liked to know," Timothy said. "He was," she said simply. "The seasons moved forward the way they do when you are paying attention to the life you are living inside them. The autumn brought the apple harvest and the preservation work and the long pleasant evenings by the fire with the windows dark, and the world contracted to the warm circle of home. Timothy built up a small practice in Harlan Creek itself, working out of a new office on the main street, handling the kinds of cases that a growing community generates: property disputes, business disagreements, the occasional criminal matter that needed proper representation. He was respected quickly, the way people who are genuinely competent tend to be in places where competence is valued above appearance. Kate ran the homestead with the same energy and attention she had always given it, but now the work had the quality of building something rather than defending something, and that was a different thing entirely. She expanded the orchard as she had planned, planting 12 new pear trees along the west slope in the spring. She started selling produce at the Harlan Creek market on Saturdays and discovered she was good at it, in the sense that she enjoyed talking to people about what she grew, and that people found her reliable and her produce excellent. The kitchen garden became something remarkable, fed by her father's compost methods and her own refinements, and by the following summer she was supplying the Harlan Creek Hotel with vegetables on a weekly basis. She also, in the quiet evenings of that first winter, taught Timothy to cook. He was a willing student and a quick one, and by February he could make a reliable stew and a serviceable corn bread, and her father's recipe for apple cake with the dried apples from the previous harvest. It became a habit that suited both of them, sharing the kitchen in the evening, him working at whatever needed working on and her making supper, or sometimes the reverse, and the sound of the house being occupied in a warm and ordinary way was something Kate had not known she missed until she had it back. They found out in April that she was expecting their first child. She told him at breakfast on a Tuesday morning, not with ceremony but plainly, because that was how they talked to each other. He set down his coffee and looked at her and then around the kitchen as if checking that everything was still real, and then looked back at her. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Well," she said. "Good, actually. Better than I expected." She paused, surprised, pleased. "Yes," he said, "both of those." He stood up and came around the table and pulled her gently up from her chair and held her for a moment in the middle of the kitchen with the morning sun coming through the east window and the coffee still hot on the stove. "Your father would have been pleased," he said quietly against her hair. He would have been beside himself, she said, and laughed slightly. He would have talked about it at length. The pregnancy was generally uncomplicated. Doc Renner, who was still practicing though his white hair had gotten whiter, visited twice and pronounced everything in good order. Hetty Paulson arrived periodically with advice and food, and the calm, reassuring manner of a woman who had been through this several times herself and knew how it went. The summer and autumn were busy and warm, and the work of the homestead continued, paced now by what Kate could comfortably do, and Timothy took on more of the physical work without being asked and without making a production of it. Their son was born on a cold, clear morning in November, the kind of morning that came in with a hard frost on the grass and the sky the color of pale water. He arrived after a labor that was difficult but not dangerous, with Doc Renner present and Hetty Paulson beside Kate throughout. And when he was finally there and breathing and indignantly announcing his presence to the world, Timothy, who had spent the preceding hours outside in the cold making himself useful by being available, was brought inside to see his son. He stood beside the bed looking at this small, loud creature wrapped in the blanket Hetty had brought, and his expression was one Kate had not seen before on him, which was a kind of undone wonder, the expression of a man who has thought himself prepared and discovered that no preparation is sufficient. "He looks like William," Timothy said after a long moment. Kate looked at the baby's face. "I think so too," she said, which was possibly wishful thinking given that all newborns look primarily like newborns, but she believed it nonetheless. They named him William Thomas Dalton, William for her father and Thomas for Timothy's, and from the first day he was called Will by everyone including them, which seemed to suit him. Will was a healthy and opinionated baby, and then a healthy and opinionated child, and he grew up between the orchard and the pasture, and the creek with the perfect ease of a child who belongs completely to a place. He was 4 years old when his sister arrived, a girl they named Elena for Timothy's mother, who had died before they could have introduced her, and who deserved to be remembered in someone. Elena was different from Will, quieter and more watchful, with her father's gray eyes and her mother's auburn hair, and she was perhaps 5 years old when Timothy caught her sitting in the apple orchard carefully reading one of his law books, which she had apparently retrieved from the study without mentioning it. "What are you finding in that?" he asked, sitting down in the grass beside her. "It's about property," she said with great seriousness, "and rights." "It is," he agreed. "Is this about Mama's land?" she asked. "The land she kept?" He looked at her for a moment. "Where did you hear about that?" "Mr. Paulson told Will," Elena said. "He said someone tried to take Mama's land and you stood up and said it was hers." Timothy was quiet for a moment. "Something like that," he said. "That was the right thing," Elena said, with the certainty of a 5-year-old who has not yet learned to doubt her own moral clarity. "Yes," he said, "it was." He told Kate about it that evening, sitting on the porch after the children were in bed, and she laughed and then was quiet and thoughtful. "She is going to be formidable," Kate said. "She already is," he said. They sat on the porch in the evening as they did most evenings when the weather allowed, in the chairs that Timothy had made over the winter from wood he had milled himself, because he had inherited more of his father's carpenter skill than he had initially given himself credit for. The stars were out in their multitudes, and the creek was audible in the stillness, and the night was enormous and kind. "I think about that night sometimes," Kate said. "The town hall meeting." "So do I," he said. "I was so frightened," she said. "I did not let it show, but I was." "I know," he said. "I could tell. And I want you to know that the steadiness you showed that evening was something I found extraordinary. Not because you weren't afraid, but because you held your ground despite being afraid, and that is a different and harder thing." She looked at the stars for a moment. "You made it possible," she said. "You took the risk of standing up in a room where Price had allies, and you said the truth plainly. Nobody argued because you gave them nothing to argue with." "The truth gave them nothing to argue with," he said. "I merely carried it into the room." "Don't undervalue the carrying," she said. He reached across and took her hand in the way he had done since San Antonio, and she threaded her fingers through his and held on. The years turned. Will grew tall and strong and developed a passion for horses and for the mechanical aspect of things, spending hours in the barn doing things to the wagon and the plow that generally resulted in them working better than they had before, which Doc Renner said was the mark of a true engineer, and which Kate suspected meant she would eventually lose him to some kind of mechanical enterprise far from the homestead, and that when that time came, she would be proud even while she missed him. Alina grew into herself with a precision and a quiet certainty that reminded Timothy of Kate in ways he told her about regularly. She was reading properly by 4 and had exhausted the supply of available books by 8, which led to a correspondence with the State Library Association in Austin and a growing collection of volumes that threatened to overtake the study entirely. 3 years after Alina, a second son arrived, strong and healthy, whom they named Daniel after no one in particular, just because it suited him. Daniel turned out to be the loudest person in the household and also the most sociable, with the gift of walking into any room and immediately knowing everyone's name, which seemed like a skill that would serve him well in whatever direction life took him. The Lockhart homestead, which had been a property under siege when Kate stood on that porch watching 2 men in suits come up the lane, became something else entirely in the years that followed the legal victory. It became a place known through the county for the quality of its produce and the hospitality of its owners and the particular atmosphere that certain households have, of being fully inhabited by people who are genuinely glad to be there. Hetty Paulson, who had been Kate's closest neighbor and friend through the worst of it, visited every Thursday for coffee and stayed for whatever the morning brought, which was often conversation that ranged across everything from the practical to the philosophical in the easy way of 2 women who have known each other long enough to have no need of small talk. Frank Paulson and Timothy developed the kind of friendship that men develop over shared outdoor work, quiet and instrumental and solid. The Garza family remained neighbors, and over time became something closer to extended family in the way that proximity and mutual respect and enough years can accomplish. Timothy practiced law in Harlan Creek for another 15 years before a younger lawyer appeared, and Timothy handed cases off gradually and spent more time at the homestead and more time reading the books that Alina continued to acquire, and more time in the evenings on the porch where the stars were always extraordinary. On an evening in the autumn of their 14th year of marriage, when Will was 12 and Alina was 8 and Daniel was 5 and the harvest was in, and the apple storage was full, and the orchard had been producing for years in the way of established trees that know their soil, Kate came out to the porch where Timothy was sitting and reading in the last of the light, and she sat in the chair beside him and looked at the sweep of the property in the golden late afternoon. The way the light moved across the grass and made the creek below glitter and turned the apple trees into something out of a story. "Do you remember," she said, "the first time you came out here to walk the property line?" "I do," he said, setting the book on his knee. "It was an evening in late April. The creek was running well." "You said it was good land," she said. "I meant it," he said. "You meant a great many things you said," she told him. "That is one of the things I love most about you." He looked at her, and the look was the one she had been receiving for 14 years, the particular look that belonged to her and to no context but this one, and it still had the same quality it had always had, of being seen by someone who was interested in exactly what was there. "I love you," he said, which he had said many times and which never lost anything in the repetition because he said it with the same weight each time, the weight of something considered and chosen. "I love you too," she said, without reservation. The evenings settled around them with the particular grace of evenings that have earned their peace, and the children were somewhere in the house being themselves, and the property spread out in all directions exactly as it had always been, held in its proper ownership by the weight of the truth and the work of 2 people who had each found in the other the thing they had not known to look for. The creek ran on in the hollow below the south pasture. The orchard stood in its long, late-day shadow. The fence line that Timothy had helped repair ran straight and sound along the east boundary, all the way to the corner post that her father had set in 1861, which was still solid in the ground and would be for a long time yet. The stars came out one by one in the deepening sky, and the night was vast and clear, and the world was enormous, and they were small within it. And there was, as Kate's mother had said, something deeply comforting in that if you let it be. She let it be. They both did. The land held them. They held each other. And the Texas night came down around the Lockhart homestead in all its enormous quiet, as it had done every night before and would do every night after. The stars indifferent and beautiful above a house that was full of the warm and ordinary noise of a family who had been given a great deal to be grateful for, and who knew it.